So welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Rachleff, the co-executive director, and we're welcoming you to this conversation today with Abdul Dire, who will be talking about his book, Oromo Witness, which he has recently written and published. And we're very excited to be able to make you more aware of his book and the stories that he tells in his book. While Abdul and I are pre-recording this conversation, we will be available after the broadcast if you want to type in questions in the comment or chat functions, and we will try to respond to them. So we want to make this as interactive as we can. The Eastside Freedom Library is committed to our mission statement to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. And we think becoming better informed about the Oromo experience in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in the United States, is a step in those directions. So Abdul is a material scientist, having gone both to his undergraduate and master's degree education at the University of Minnesota. Not trained as a historian and a writer, but he is clearly a better historian and a writer than I am a material scientist. So we're delighted to have him with us today. Abdul, to start with, would you say a little bit about your own personal history, where you were born and grew up, and how you came to the United States?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Peter, for having me, and thank you for the work that you do here. I really appreciate it. So about me, my name is Abdul Dire, as you mentioned, and I was born in Ethiopia in the Oromia region, which is the southeast province called Bale. And my hometown, Bidre, is a really small city of about 10,000 or so people back then. It is rapidly growing, of course, over the last 2 decades. I was raised by my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, which is a cultural thing over there. So she raised me and my older sister. Growing up with grandma really gave me the opportunity to attend school, which is an opportunity that at the time only me and my sister had. But that early education really gave me the foundation to seek further education when I come to the United States. So my family left Ethiopia in 1998 because of political persecution. My uncle, who I will talk about, I wrote a book about, was targeted by the previous government led by the TPLF. You know, how things quickly changed, Peter. You know, those same folks who were driven out so many, the exodus that happened in 1990s to the neighboring countries into the west of the Oromos and many other nationalities. Now the same folks who did that now on the run, you know, for their own life as of, you know, a few weeks ago. Just kind of amazing time to be alive. So after we left Ethiopia, I went to the neighboring Kenya, and we became refugees and lived there for a couple of years. And you know, fortunately, we came to the United States about 20 years ago to Minnesota. You know, we didn't really choose Minnesota. Minnesota chose us. But after coming here, I really loved it here and ended up staying. And part of it is there is a big East African community here in Twin Cities. And one of the largest Ethiopian community here in Minnesota, with particularly the Oromo community being the largest within the Ethiopian community. You know, so much so that we call Minnesota Little Oromia, right? Anyway, so that's kind of my story, how I got to here. And as you mentioned, I continued my education. I did material science and engineering, bachelor's at the U of M, and very recently I did also master's in management of technology, and I work in that field.
And so why did you decide to write this book?
I wrote Oromo Witness to preserve oral history. My ancestors, and I think which is broadly probably true for the indigenous people in general, relied on transmitting history, culture, language, and wisdom from generation to generation through oral history. And that system, when we come to the United States, is broken because the older generation, there is a generational gap. The older generation speaks Oromo language or some of other native language, but kids who are born here, like my children and many of their peers, they primarily speak English. And there is a gap. And now how do you transmit orally, from generation to generation? So Oromo Witness is written to bridge that gap, telling history in the language that this generation who was born here could understand. And that is the primarily my focus. And the second thing is I wanted to write a very specific history. And first of all, very little is written about what I wrote about the Bale People's Movement, which is a very important movement that happened in 1960s. 1960s, as you know, throughout Africa is, it's about independence and it's about, freedom. Even here in the United States, we had the, civil rights movement at its peak. So similar things were happening, and back in my home region, in Oromia, and specifically in the Bale, there was a movement, and very little written about it. The ones that's written about it is written from the perspective of the state. And the other issue was even other part of Oromo history, when it's typically written, it's written by historians and scholars, and it is like history textbook. What I wanted to write was, something that people could relate to at a visceral level, and it's telling personal story. That is why I tried to focus on made more like biographical, family and personal biographical. And if you're asking me why specifically about your uncle, Hangasu Waqo Lugo, who was a portrait on the front of the book, who I wrote about, between his experience, his participation in the Oromo movement, and his father's generation, who we spent a lot of time with at the peak of that movement. He covers, the last over 100 years of the Oromo and the Ethiopia history. And that's just simply powerful. I did not want it to waste it. Although I interviewed many people, but I primarily relied on that continuity of history, getting that from that archive from the source, because my family was really at the core of that movement, and following the life of those key characters, it really paints a nice picture of that history of the modern Oromo movement. And the last thing I want to say is that the history, as you know, is written by the victors, right? Yeah. It's a well-accepted concept out there. What is previously written is written from the perspective of the Ethiopian state, Ethiopian narrative, and others kind of took it from there and write their own things. I wanted to write the book from the perspective of the people to kind of correct that injustice.
It's so interesting to me how parallel your intellectual journey has been to the journey that my generation of historians in the United States has taken. So those of us who were formed in the 1960s and 1970s embraced oral history as a way to tell the story of immigrants, of workers, of sharecroppers, of domestic servants, of people whose stories were left out because the dominant story was told from the perspective of the top. I'm reminded, and I shouldn't get off on a tangent, but one of our favorite books was an oral history of an African American sharecropper, and the book was called All God's Dangers. And he was a man who lived into his 80s, but never learned how to read and write. And over the course of this oral history narrative, he names and says something definitive about over 200 mules that he had owned over the course of his lifetime as a farmer. And as the person who took down his oral story and packaged it into a book said, if you're not able to read and write, you'd better have a really good memory because you have to remember everything. So it's an interesting, to me, an interesting parallel in this kind of work that you've done and I and others have done. So did you interview your uncle Hangasu in Oromo or in English?
I interviewed in Oromo. He only speaks Oromo. He can understand a little bit of English, but his primary language is Oromo. So I interviewed in Oromo. I had I had another challenge of interpreting that over to English as well.
Right? Yes, yeah. And so you had to transcribe some of it and then translate it into English. And in your text, there are long quotes in Oromo and then translated into English. And it's a beautiful way that you have done this. Clearly, your uncle has been a very important person in your life. Would you say a little bit about his influence on you and what he has meant to you?
Yeah, I mean, he is, so he's the reason I am here in the United States, and he's the reason I was able to go to school and be able to see through my education, which has an impact on, economic part, being able to get, the right kind of, job of my choice. So he has significant impact, and he cared deeply about education, and that is kind of he himself he went to he attended school briefly after the war ended in at the end of 1970. It was kind of short-lived, so he was a dropout of basically middle school. Dropout, and but he understood the value of education, and to really improve and to make social changes. He sees education as a key in achieving that. But education by itself is not sufficient, but it is kind of prerequisite as a starting point, and then maybe organizing around a cause, is probably the other thing that will kind of take you to the next level. But he deeply cared about education, and I benefited from that, coming here and encouraging me and supporting me throughout my early years to attend the school.
I can only imagine how he must feel that here he is on the cover of a book. Surely he never imagined that this would happen in his lifetime. It's a beautiful thing. And And I'm intrigued by how you convey his belief in education as a way that what one generation may not achieve in their own lifetime becomes the task of the next generation to take on. It's a beautifully optimistic worldview, given the remarkable challenges that his generation faced.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I also feel that your book is a primer in global politics. So we have not only this conflict between the Ethiopian state and Oromos, but we also have the European colonizers in Italy having arrived twice on the scene in your account. And we have this very complicated role that Somalia plays. So can you say a little bit about the Italian influence on the one hand and the Somali presence on the other hand?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I think as Ethiopians are proud. One of the point of pride is the ability to defeat the colonial power, Italy in this case, twice. The first time at the Battle of Adwa, and second time, a 5-year occupation, and later, kind of with the help of the Britain and others, Italians were driven out. And I talk about that history, how it happens in the book. And that stays the way it is, right? So the whole country participated in that. But I also tell a different kind of a story. Ethiopia is from external view, it was one of the oldest independent country in Africa, if not in the world. But if you really look at within the country, it's also subjugated and oppressed its own people. And I started the book with, going back another, about 120 years ago, when the current state of the current map of Ethiopia is kind of, drawn by Menelik, who is kind of responsible for doing that. And there are many things that happened during that conquest in terms of, the killing and the massacres and, many atrocious things that happened that, people could read in many history books. And then there was no effort about, building the nation, and kind of this Ethiopian broad Ethiopian project non-existent, especially in the South. And I think what happened was people just couldn't get out of their own head. Up in the state, there's this feeling of, we're the superior race and so forth and so forth, and kind of looking at, the rest of the ethnicities and people who lived in there as, inferior, and so that they should be subjugated and so forth. What that created was, right, and I talk about in the book, because of that oppression, continued negligence by the state, people in the South, especially in Bale, never felt really that, this government is part of them. And all they see is about oppression and killing and extracting their resources without any representation. When the Italians came second time, the Arsi Oromos in the South, they did not, fight them. Really, in fact, those 5 years were the gap when they had opportunity to think for themselves for the first time, because the Italians, as foreign colonizers, they know the issues that Ethiopia is having, and they wanted to exploit that. So they gave people religious freedoms, and they gave people to be able to speak and operate media in their own language. So this is a significant change for people, the Arsi Oromos in the South who stood with, who didn't fight the Italians. And that kind of continues. We jump. Of course, the Italians get kicked out, and the empire, the old empire, comes back and exerts the same force on the population. There is all these grievances going on up until 1960, to the point that people who lived in the southern area was forcefully were told they were evicted from their own land. Right, and that kind of created a whole kind of that led into the Bale revolt, what was called Bale revolt, where people went to the neighboring Somalia, which just got its own independence, for seeking support. And initially Somalia just supported them. There is this, as I talk about, there is proximity of land, there is proximity of the language and the culture and religion. They could relate to each other quite a bit, and it's a friendly neighbor. They supported it, but throughout, and ambition grew, right? And they also wanted to use this movement as a path to kind of get back some territory from Ethiopia, which the Oromos in the southern, the Bale people never agreed to that. Of course, they're trying to fight on one hand, the Somalis, not from taking their land, and on the other hand, they fought the Ethiopian government at the same time. So it was very complicated and a difficult time for the people. They just couldn't have their own. On one hand, their agenda get hijacked by some forces, groups within the Somalia who have this vision of greater Somalia and uniting this under one Somalia, and the government of Ethiopia, who never always saw Bale as as a place of problem. Some of that is still continues, like this issue of bad governance, continues to this day. But hopefully, we'll get on the right track.
One of the things that I learned from your book is that there is another name for Addis Ababa.
Yes.
And I know if I have any criticism of your book,
yeah,
it's that it would have helped me to have a map, to actually see where places are. But I have heard from people that Addis is really in Oromia, and so is an ethnically mixed metropolitan center. But how do you say Finfinne? How do
Finfinne? Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, and does that have a meaning?
Yes.
You make a choice early in the book.
Yeah.
Say, I'm only going to refer to it as Finfinne for the rest of the book, and it's the first time I had heard the word. You're smiling. Say something about that.
No, I'm glad you picked it up, and I think both names are totally fine, right? So it's known it was Addis Ababa, which means new flower, as an Amharic term. In Oromo, it's called Finfinne or Shaggar. There are other names, Oromo names as well, and I chose in this case Finfinne, which means spring water. And there are spring waters around the town, and I chose to refer to it as Finfinne because I'm writing the book, like I said, from the perspective of the people, right? And we can call it whatever we agreed on, going forward. And I certainly don't have a problem with the Addis Ababa, but it is important to tell that perspective of the people. This is what Oromos used to call it before, the state is built to the current state. Oromos used to call it Finne Shaggar. So that is part of I think the theme of my book is to tell it from the perspective of the people.
Yeah, great. in the arena of political strategy, I was very struck by your uncle and his father, but especially your uncle and his generation. I mean, he becomes a political activist at 14. Um, and the ways that he figured out with others to operate within, so after the revolt, so by the late 60s, early 70s, as the Selassie is then overthrown and the Derg comes to power, and the younger Oromos are figuring out how to become the civic administrators of the Ethiopian state. I mean, I think one of the things that you do such a good job at communicating is the legacy of this feudal state, how top heavy this state is, and this struggle, as you say, from the people to have their own language, their own religion, and ultimately their own civic administration, so that they're not paying bribes and taxes to a government that is oppressing them. But for a period of maybe a decade or so, that generation is very smart in how they're operating within the system, until it seems that the pressure from Somalia, as the new Siad Barre government comes to power, and this vision of a greater Somalia, this pressure that now they're being attacked from two sides, and it becomes untenable to maintain that kind of being deft in how they operate. It seems so interesting to me in terms of political strategies anywhere in the world, that out of Bale, that they're trying to figure this out.
I think you put it exactly right, and that it's the first time, the Oromo professionals trying to get their head together and trying to figure out what is the best strategy, and there were really, I mean, great mind. I just read a few this week a book written about one of the key figure, the Oromo figure, Zagaye Asfaw, who's my uncle knows very well, and he is a key architect in machinery of the land for the tiller declaration that the Derg made. If you think about the feudal system that took away, that farmers who are their own land, now the state and the church comes and takes over. They don't longer have it, but they farm their own land with their own resources, and they feed it up to somebody else, to the landlord. And that is it took significant work and networking, movement within the university and the student and the professors, to make that kind of change happen. And it was kind of the first fruit of that movement that now the tillers get to own the land again. And it was a huge thing. So that was just fascinating to read that book, for me. But from the political side as well, and I talk about many Oromo, professionals who played a key role that my uncle worked with, and they really, because the downfall of the emperor was kind of very quick, and there wasn't preparation of much, so there was quite a bit of a space, and the Oromos who are on the highland who were there wanted to take that advantage of that to how to figure out how to benefit their own community, and it was really phenomenal what they're able to do, even under trying to making sure moving a very sensitive line, right? So they're working with a government that is very brutal. Any mistake, any doubt, could just eliminate you. But they did what they could. What that did was kind of started not really what they intended at the beginning, but at least the name continued, and the legacy continued until this day. The Oromo Liberation Front that was kind of created back then, it's kind of a household name now, right? And it has not achieved what it was hoped for, and it's definitely right. And my uncle eventually got frustrated with them as well and left the organization itself. But it played a key role in terms of the cultural and language revival of the Oromo.
So maybe shifting gears a little bit away from the story itself to what you hope the consequences of your telling the story will be. What would you, and you do talk about your children, and you've already talked in our conversation about the challenge of losing the language over a generation. What do you hope that other Oromo people will take away from reading Oromo Witness?
Yeah. And I think, primarily what I would like to communicate, to the young and old, is first, I want people, especially young people, to know where they come from. And I want them to understand the sacrifices and the struggle that, the previous generation went through. And I'm doing that because really, the previous generation met many challenges, as you have just articulated. And I want them to know they can, whatever challenge they face, they can overcome challenge as well if they work through it and systematically and frame it, the right way. And they will be able to work through it. So that's kind of my hope, understanding the past so that we can, learn from it, as we move forward, so that we don't have to repeat, some of the same history. It's my hope for the generation here and in other Oromos in general, to learn from history, so that we can build a better system going forward.
And moving outward from there, what would you hope that Amharas and Somalis and now I'm becoming aware of Anuaks. This young man has been elected to the city council of Austin, Minnesota, which is a remarkable achievement.
Yeah.
What would you hope that other Ethiopians in the diaspora might also learn from your book?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think, the starting point is understanding each other. And I discussed the history for the area that I focused on for the Bale very candidly. And I want us to talk to each other about the past with candor, not to divide, not to cause more issues, but to understand what happened, right? And that is the first step toward healing and toward moving really forward. I really believe that. And the Ethiopian history has this history of subjugation, of injustice. We're left with these legacies. Those people who've done these atrocities, the majority of them are not with us anymore. So there is no point in denying, the pain of the people who are subjugated, who are oppressed in the country. So acknowledgement is the first piece. And I know that, you know, some of this pain and grievances are at a different level for different people. For some people, it's a few weeks ago, and for others, it's 27 years. For others, it's 100 years.
Yeah.
Right? But this ability to listen to each other and, you know, not attaching to ourselves to the past, but a better looking at the better future that we can build. And all the basis of all of that is acknowledgement and understanding. And I hope that it will start the conversation toward that. That will be my hope for other Ethiopians toward reconciliation.
Great. And then what about us crazy Americans who look at you and say, well, you're a Black guy, or, you know, aren't you this or that, or what is Oromo? And what do you want the wider American communities to appreciate, understand about your experiences?
Yeah, and that's really an excellent question, and one that kind of you know, surprised me, you know, from many readers, and I want to actually hear, if I may ask you what you took from the book as a non-Oromo, as Minnesotan.
Mm-hmm.
I do have few stories to share as well, but I would love to hear maybe you know, a few words from you as well, what you took away.
Thank you. I mean, I think I've said some of those things already.
Right.
You know, how complicated the history is. Because I'm a historian of immigration to the United States, I'm very quick to see parallels. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is like what the Puerto Ricans experienced, or this is like what the Croatians experienced, or that being seen as sort of carrying the passport of the country that has forced them to become immigrants from where they had lived. The very dramatic stories of seeking the assistance of the Somali government and getting that assistance, but then losing it again, and you know, your uncle ends up in prison twice, not in Ethiopia, but in Somalia. And so, you know, what a crazy, and yet we can see how it all made a certain sense.
Yes.
And I think too, and here I am with another parallel. My wife and I are currently watching on PBS this series that was shot in Germany called Line of Separation, about what happened in what became East Germany after World War II. Yeah. And the roles played by the Russians, and the roles played by the Americans, and the roles played by different Germans in collaborating with one side or the other. And the one consistency is the totalitarianism of the government. And you tell a story beginning with Menelik and Haile Selassie and the Derg, and now we have the open question of, you know, what is Mr. Abe's, what is his course in history? But it seemed like no matter who was in charge, they very quickly came to use the machinery of the state to perpetuate their own power and to deny the humanity of others. And I think that it's tragic that that's a story the whole world can share. That if we think about the Uyghurs in China, or the people in Hong Kong struggling for democracy, that governments that claimed a revolutionary mantle and then became oppressors. And it doesn't matter if people are Asian or African or European, we see this behavior.
Mhm.
And I love your optimism and your uncle's optimism that if we can teach these lessons to the next generation, they will begin to make a better world. And I can only, as a teacher, hope that. And so your book fits that
Yeah.
whole panorama. From
Yes. That's amazing. That's really amazing how common
yeah,
it is, and the connections that you made are just amazing and fascinating. And that is similar thing I'm hearing from readers who are not Oromo, who are not from the continent.
yeah,
So I had a friend. We've known each other for a long time, and he moved out of state. He lived in Twin Cities, so he's very familiar with the community here. He said, "I have many Ethiopian friends, and several of them are Oromos." But he said, I had bad perception of Oromo for a long time until I read your book.
mhm,
But he said, after I read it, I reread it every chapter. And because I realized, he said, the Oromo people's struggle is identical to my people's struggle. And he's from different continents.
yeah,
And the other one, similar to what you mentioned about earlier about the other immigrants, I can't, you won't believe how many people told me this after reading the book, especially that opening scene
yes,
of where I found my uncle working late night in a restaurant, mopping the floor on the Lake Street in Minneapolis. You won't believe how many people told me that reminds me of my grandmother, my grandfather. These are people who come from Europe, right? Immigrants. So in a way, Oromo Witness, it is an immigrant story.
yes,
It is an American story, isn't it? Every immigrant community that came through it, like you mentioned, kind of went through some of those things. The other person kind of he said it reminded me, reading your book reminded me the indigenous, the Native Americans experience in America. The Oromo people's experience in Ethiopia reminded me the indigenous people's experience in the United States.
right, being kicked off their own land. Yes,
yeah, it is a human story
yes,
that the worst of people's impulse hasn't changed yet, whether we're here in the US or in the remote part of the world like in Ethiopia.
yeah, and I think that your book is an important piece of the puzzle, that the more that we're encouraged to put that puzzle together, the better the legacy that we're able to pass on to the next generation, to see the humanity in each other. So maybe one last thing. I feel like it would be irresponsible of us if we did not address in some way what's going on in Ethiopia now as we speak. Um, I think that I was very pleased that you had an article in the Sahan Journal talking about what's going on. That obviously you do not take pleasure in that the Tigrayans who were persecutors of the Oromos are now themselves being persecuted, because, as you said, those were people who are no longer with us, that the perpetrators are long since gone. I think that many people had great hope and optimism about Mr. Abe as a leader and the potentials of peace and justice in East Africa and the Horn. What do you think is happening? And because it strikes me, it's the opposite of what you and I have been talking about, of people recognizing the humanity in each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a mess, right? when I finished the book, like you mentioned, end of 2009, it was a high point for Ethiopia in its recent history. And the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed just won Nobel Peace Prize, and he by ending the war with neighboring Eritrea up in the north, same area, and taking a lot of bold moves within the country to free up political space and political prisoners and journalists and media and so forth. It tried to put the country on the path to peace, stability, and prosperity. But of course, if you look at right now the event of the last few weeks, the country is going through a very difficult time, and to some extent, we have to expect, right? So people like me, optimist, kind of get in trouble because when we're going through a transitional period, and transition by nature it's a change process, and we do have to expect there are forces that do not want the change, that want to sabotage the change, and those forces will exert forces throughout. But as you mentioned, what happens is who suffers? The one that suffers the most are innocent people. Right. As a result of the military operation and conflict in Tigray and the northern Ethiopia, close to 50,000 Ethiopians became refugees in Sudan, in neighboring Sudan. And I hoped at least this exodus of refugees and young people leaving the country would stop by now. But unfortunately, that's a reality that we are looking at, regardless of who caused it. We need to be able to say, that is not right for innocent people to experience, live their home, and there are many who probably on their way there who are killed and massacred, from what we hear from the media, and that's unfortunate. And like I said, the change is a messy process, and I'm just hoping that it's 2 o'clock. This is the messy part is behind us, because the true test of Abiy Ahmed is really what he does. If he's able to subdue this the conflict in Tigray, and let's say, they were well armed, well trained military. After this, what do you do? And this is where Ethiopia got it wrong all along, right? In the Menelik and Haile Selassie, they got the territories, but after that, they're just stayed with their own mind and in their own head. But if things can be done right now by really reestablishing everything for the community and establishing, representation for people, and finding a way to reconcile, finding something that would bring a sustainable stability to the region, whatever that means to the people, not to the people, the perpetrators, right. But the people deserve better, right? And they need to feel like now they are, they are well represented, and they are part of this country, and they share, the good and the bad with the country, and they need to be, made felt that they are part of it, and they're not going to be excluded because of what few people has done in their name. And that's my hope on a way forward. Really, if we can achieve that, which is difficult, there is a lot of mistrust, right? Yeah. But if he can do that, hopefully we can create a better future. If we fail to do that, and I think the cycle will continue. But I'm really hopeful, right? So I tend to look at things long term, like over 100 years. Yeah. If we look at the event of the last few weeks, it's very discouraging. But if you look at over 100 years of Ethiopian history, things are getting better slowly, and people don't want to admit this. But and I can tell you, things are improving. From Haile Selassie to Derg, there is huge improvement. The recognition of other nations that live in that country, to some extent, even the land going back to the tiller. And then in 1990s, while we, object and everything that, the charter of 1990s, the EPRDF, the PDF regime did, there are positive things, establishing this federal system that recognize different ethnicities in the country and their culture and their language. It is a progress. And now we need to build on top of that. We cannot afford to go back to where it was, and we won't, even if anybody wants it. We just need to build it from here forward. So that's my hope still.
Mine as well. We will be celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King Day in mid-January, and one of the many things that Dr. King said was that the arc of history is long, but that it does bend towards justice.
Yes.
And I just so appreciate your book and your work and your outlook, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. Let me just say again to people who are watching that you are welcome to type in comments and questions for this next period of the program, and Abdul will try to respond to them. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time, Abdul Dire. And again, one more time, we will appreciate your uncle's face and your beautiful book, Oromo Witness. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank